When Henry Blackwood, millionaire of Britain's largest shipping empire, decided to pretend he was dying in his bed at the Cotswolds estate, he thought he would finally discover who in his family truly loved him, and who was merely waiting for his death to claim their inheritance. What he discovered in those 72 hours of deception was so devastating that when he rose from his bed to reveal the truth, nothing in the Blackwood family would ever be the same again. Because sometimes, when you play with the fire of truth, you end up burning everything you believed in. It was a cold December morning when Henry Blackwood, 72 years old, patriarch of the shipping empire, Blackwood Maritime, with a fortune of $750 million, awoke in his magnificent manor house in the Cotswolds with a decision that would forever change his family. Gazing at the oak-beamed ceiling of his bedroom, adorned with Tudor-era carvings, Henry felt the weight of a lifetime dedicated to building an empire that perhaps none of his heirs truly deserved. The suspicions he had harbored for years had crystallized into certainty the previous week, when he overheard his son James whispering to his brother Edward in the main drawing room of the manor. The words had pierced Henry's heart like icy daggers, confirming his worst fears about his children's true feelings towards him. Henry had 3 children: James, 45 years old, operations director of the company with his wife Charlotte, always so attentive but with that calculating smile; Edward, 42 years old, responsible for international expansion with his girlfriend Victoria, a model from Yorkshire; and Sebastian, 38 years old, the rebel who had always refused to work in the family business to pursue his passion for theater. The idea maturing in the old businessman's mind was as ingenious as it was cruel. He would pretend to be gravely ill at death's door to observe his family members' true reactions without masks or hypocrisy. Who would show genuine love? Who had already begun calculating the inheritance? Dr. Pemberton, the family physician for 20 years, was initially reluctant to accept Henry's plan, but eventually agreed to play the role of the doctor announcing a terminal diagnosis. Reginald, the trusted personal assistant, installed hidden cameras throughout the manor to record every conversation and gesture when family members believed themselves alone. On the morning of 15th of December, Henry put his plan into action. He called James with a weak voice, feigning a sudden collapse. Within an hour, the entire family had gathered at the manor, all wearing expressions of apparent concern. Dr. Pemberton arrived with his black bag and the grave demeanor of one bearing terrible news. After a feigned thorough examination, the doctor descended to communicate the invented diagnosis to the family: advanced pancreatic cancer, 3 weeks to live at most. The silence that followed was deafening, and Henry, pretending to sleep but listening to everything through the intercom, heard distinctly reactions that chilled him, not only tears, but also what seemed like a sigh of relief from someone. It was the beginning of a test that would reveal truths more bitter than any real illness. The first night of his feigned terminal state opened Henry's eyes to a reality he never would have wanted to see. Lying in his bed with eyes half closed, he observed family members taking turns in his room, each believing themselves alone with an unconscious dying man. Charlotte was the first devastating revelation. She sat beside the bed, taking his hand with apparent tenderness, but her eyes showed no pain. They showed pure calculation. Her gaze constantly shifted towards the cabinet of important documents, towards the hidden safe, towards valuable objects. When she believed Henry was sleeping deeply, Charlotte quietly rose and began rifling through papers on the desk, evidently searching for the will or information about bank accounts. James entered shortly after and moved Charlotte away from the desk, but not from moral indignation. His words whispered in the corridor devastated Henry. The concern wasn't for Charlotte's inappropriateness, but for the wrong timing. They must wait for him to die in peace. Then they would have all the time to deal with the inheritance. Edward arrived in the dead of night from London, and his first concern wasn't his father's condition, but organizing an urgent meeting with his brothers to discuss the situation. Henry heard him telephoning someone who sounded like a solicitor, asking for information about how to contest an unsatisfactory will. But the most painful stab came from Sebastian, whom Henry had always considered the most honest, due to his refusal to work in the company. When he thought no one could hear him, Sebastian confided to his partner Victoria that he would finally be free from this burden, and that, with his share of the inheritance, he could open the West End theater he had always dreamed of. The second night brought the most devastating discovery of all. The three brothers gathered in the main drawing room, believing Henry slept deeply under the effect of non-existent sedatives. The conversation that followed completely destroyed the illusions Henry still harbored about his children. James spoke with the cold tone of a calculating businessman. They had to be realistic. Father had always threatened to leave everything to charity if they weren't up to standard. They must ensure that in his final days he felt loved, so he wouldn't change the will at the last moment. Edward revealed having already consulted Solicitor Williams to contest any testamentary changes, arguing that Father wasn't lucid due to the illness. Sebastian, the son Henry thought was purest of heart, added the phrase that definitively broke the old patriarch's heart. Father had lived too long. He should have retired years ago and let them manage the company. Henry felt his world collapse. His children, for whom he had sacrificed everything, couldn't wait for him to die. There was no love, gratitude, or genuine affection, only ruthless calculations, barely concealed greed, and impatience to finally get their hands on his inheritance. The test was revealing a family he no longer recognized, and the worst was yet to come. The third day of that macabre performance brought revelations that exceeded even Henry's blackest expectations. The hidden cameras captured betrayals that went far beyond simple greed for inheritance, revealing a web of deceptions that had transformed his family into a nest of vipers. Charlotte, believing herself alone in the library whilst Henry slept, made a telephone call that froze the old businessman's blood. The daughter-in-law he had considered like a daughter had an extramarital affair and was waiting for Henry's death to reveal everything and move to Edinburgh with her lover. James, the betrayed husband, suspected nothing, still convinced he had a devoted wife by his side. The discovery about Edward was equally shocking, but of a different nature. His relationship with Victoria, the beautiful Yorkshire model he had presented as the love of his life, was completely false. Henry discovered through the recordings that Edward was paying Victoria £200,000 to play the role of the loving girlfriend, at least until the reading of the will. The model, bored by this comedy, was only waiting for the end of the performance to collect payment and disappear. But the deepest betrayal came from James, the son in whom Henry had placed the greatest hopes as natural successor. Whilst believing himself alone in his study, James conducted a series of telephone calls that revealed a betrayal transcending the family sphere. He was selling company secrets to foreign competitors, already planning to dismantle the Blackwood Empire once he took control. The recorded calls showed James promising the sale of the Liverpool shipping division for $50 million below market value, betraying not only his father, but also 3 generations of family sacrifices. The son who should inherit and protect the company was literally selling everything before Henry had even died. Sebastian, whom Henry thought was at least honest in his rebellion, proved to be the most ruthless of all. Not only had he already put valuable manor objects up for sale online, but he had also contacted the press to sell the story of shipping magnate Henry Blackwood's death to tabloid magazines. He wanted the world to know what kind of tyrant his father had been, defining his imminent death as liberation for everyone. The situation reached its peak when Henry discovered that even his beloved grandchildren, James's children, had been transformed into little puppets by cynical parents. Charlotte had instructed the children on how to behave during grandfather's illness. pretend sadness, tell him how much they loved him, all orchestrated to ensure he wouldn't change the will. The children, innocent victims of unscrupulous parents, were reciting scripts written by greedy adults. Even his grandchildren's love, the last pure thing he thought he had, was a carefully orchestrated lie. Henry realized the test had revealed a truth more terrible than any nightmare. His family not only didn't love him, but actively considered him an obstacle to be removed as soon as possible. He was surrounded by strangers who bore his name but had sold their souls for money.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Whilst Henry continued his performance as a dying man, his brilliant businessman's mind had already devised a revenge plan that would devastate his family as much as they had devastated his heart. If they wanted to perform a comedy, he would give them the ending they deserved. On the fourth morning, Henry called each of his sons separately, pretending to want to share his final wishes. What he did instead was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that would have made the most ruthless strategist tremble. With James, the traitor selling the company to competitors, Henry played the role of the father, finally recognizing his son's merits. He promised him 60% of shares and company presidency, asking him to sign some documents to protect the company from inheritance tax. James, blinded by greed disguised as filial emotion, signed everything without reading carefully. He was actually signing detailed confessions of all his corporate betrayals. Edward received the promise of all international shipping properties and $100 million in cash, on condition of personally managing some sale procedures. He, too, enthusiastically signed documents that were actually written confessions of his fake relationship with Victoria and fiscally compromising. Sebastian was manipulated with the promise of the art collection valued at $50 million and complete freedom for his theatrical career. Moved to tears by his repentant father's words, he signed documents accusing him of theft and illegal sale of family assets. Charlotte received $20 million to care for James, and thinking of her future in Edinburgh, enthusiastically signed documents accusing her of adultery and misappropriation. All signed documents were immediately sent to the London law firm with precise instructions to open them only after Henry's death or upon his written request. The true stroke of genius came on the fifth evening, when Henry called everyone to his room for what was to be his final speech. With a weak voice and tearful eyes, he began an apparently moving monologue about his mistakes as a father and his love for the family. For a moment, seeing tears on his loved ones' faces, Henry thought he glimpsed a glimmer of genuine love. But James ruined everything by whispering to his brother that it was perfect. Father was dying with guilt, so the will would remain favorable. It was at that instant that Henry made his final decision. He would not only reveal the truth about his health condition, but would completely destroy every family member's life. They had chosen to treat him like an obstacle to be removed. He would show them what it meant to have a true enemy. The following day, Henry told Reginald to prepare everything for the grand finale. Everyone must be gathered in the main drawing room, along with the solicitor, notary, and journalists who were about to witness the performance of their lives. The test was over. Now began the most ruthless reckoning in British business history. On the morning of the seventh day, Henry prepared for the moment he had planned down to the smallest detail. He dressed in his finest dark suit, the one for great occasions, and looked in the mirror. The man gazing back was no longer the dying patriarch, but the formidable businessman who had built an empire from nothing. At 10 o'clock sharp, Reginald gathered the entire family in the main drawing room of the manor. The atmosphere was solemn. Everyone believed they had been summoned for Henry's final moments. Also present were Solicitor Thompson, Notary Davies, Dr. Pemberton, and, to everyone's surprise, 3 journalists from The Times, The Telegraph, and The Sun. At 10:15, Henry descended the stairs, not with the uncertain step of a dying man, but with the confident stride of the leader he had always been. The silence in the drawing room became deafening when everyone saw him perfectly healthy, elegantly dressed, with the sharp gaze of one who controls the situation. Henry's first words were like a bomb exploding in the silence. He wasn't ill. He wasn't dying. It had all been a test to see how his family would behave thinking he was on death's door. Dr. Pemberton had simply played the role assigned to him. The pallor that painted itself across family members' faces was immediate and devastating. Charlotte seemed about to faint. Edward began visibly sweating. James attempted to stammer a justification, whilst Sebastian appeared paralyzed by shock. Henry approached a large screen prepared by Reginald and began the projection that would forever destroy the Blackwood family. Videos recorded by hidden cameras showed every private conversation, every betrayal, every misdeed committed in the preceding 6 days. One by one, Henry enumerated each person's guilt. James had betrayed the company by selling secrets to competitors. Charlotte had a lover in Edinburgh and had manipulated the children. Edward had paid Victoria to fake a relationship. Sebastian had sold manor objects and contacted tabloid magazines. Every accusation was supported by irrefutable video and audio evidence. The journalists frantically took photos and notes, aware they were witnessing the greatest family scandal in British business. But Henry wasn't finished. With a voice growing ever more glacial, he revealed that everyone had signed complete confessions of their crimes, believing they were signing inheritance documents. The trap had closed perfectly upon them. Desperate attempts at justification were swept away by crushing evidence. There was no escape, no possibility of denying the proof. The Blackwood family had been unmasked before the entire world. Henry moved toward Solicitor Thompson, who opened a briefcase extracting a series of legal documents. The moment of judgment had arrived, and the Blackwood family waited in silence for a condemnation they knew would be devastating. The consequences announced by Henry were merciless and final. James was dismissed from the company with immediate effect, reported for corporate treason and industrial espionage, and his inheritance reduced to 0. Charlotte faced charges for adultery and misappropriation, whilst the grandchildren would be placed with Henry's sister until the parents proved themselves worthy. Edward completely lost his inheritance. The promised shipping properties were donated to the Blackwood Foundation for Orphan Assistance, and his tax crimes were already in the hands of HM Revenue and Customs. Victoria, seeing the situation deteriorate, left the manor without looking back. Sebastian received the deepest stab. Henry admitted having always loved him for his supposed honesty, but discovering he was the greediest of all had broken his heart. His inheritance would go entirely to theatrical projects for disadvantaged youth. The new will, read by the solicitor, allocated 80% of the estate, £600 million, to the Margaret Blackwood Foundation for Cancer Research. The remainder went to loyal company employees. The manor became a museum. The company transformed into a workers' cooperative. Desperate attempts at contestation were rejected with the signed documents confessing their crimes. Henry granted them 1 hour to leave the manor, promising their personal effects would be forwarded. As the former sons left the manor like ghosts, followed by photographers' flashes, Henry remained in the drawing room with Reginald, Dr. Pemberton, and the solicitor. Looking out at the Cotswolds countryside gleaming under the December sun, the patriarch confessed to having built an empire for his family, but discovering that family had become his worst enemy. 6 months later, the story of the patriarch's revenge circled the globe. Blackwood Maritime flourished as a cooperative. The Margaret Blackwood Foundation funded revolutionary research, whilst the sons attempted legal action in vain, trapped by documents signed in their own hand. Henry lived his final years in the peace of knowing his empire was in worthy hands. He never saw his biological children again, but symbolically adopted hundreds of orphaned children through his foundation. The patriarch had won the final battle of his life, that for the dignity and honor of the Blackwood name. He had proved that even blood can betray, but true values are immortal. If this story has made you reflect on what family truly means and the dangers of greed that can destroy even the most sacred bonds, give it a like and share this video. Henry Blackwood taught us that sometimes the greatest love is that which knows when to say enough when necessary. Don't miss the next episode, where you'll discover another incredible story about how appearances can deceive and how truth always emerges. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss stories that will make you reflect on life. Next video. A woman inherits her grumpy neighbor's house. What she finds in the basement shocks her. A story that will make you believe in the power of second chances.